Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got whizzing around in front of me today is one of the heavy mechanized infantry from Trench Crusade, belonging to the new Antioch faction, and he's cool. There's not a lot to say about it really, it's just a really brilliant miniature, and I love the aesthetic of it. So I decided I wanted to have a crack at painting one myself. Now, to touch briefly on where the method for this actually came from, there is a wonderful resource out there, the Army Painter Academy. And this one, it's not a sponsored video or anything, I just think they're really brilliant. And up there is a bunch of tutorials for how you can get the most out of, obviously, Army Painter paints in the main, but the methods will work for pretty much anything. So this one actually comes from Tyler, who's their social media specialist. And I really like his methods. For the most part, we have very similar tastes. So this is an airbrush method that I have adapted to throw the airbrush out the window. All the paints for this will be listed in the description, and following along with Tyler's method for the most part, they are going to be from the John Blanche range, the masterclass sets. So let's get started. Okay, so once our miniature is assembled, first thing to do, of course, is to prime him. Now here I've used matte black from the Army Painter. Since most of the colours we're going to be using are predominantly quite dark, a black is going to make sense. Don't worry too much about which it is. You could also use a dark grey, so something like Mechanicus Standard Grey would probably work quite well here, though if you do choose that, then you're probably going to want to make sure that your first couple of coats are a bit more solid than what I'm going to show you. All the same, black is black is black, we are primed, let's get painting. So what I've got to start with is one of my cheap brushes from the stationery aisle, something nice and big with a flat edge is going to be easiest for this. And I have some Midnight Olive here with just a tiny wee bit of water in it. So I'm going to load up about half my brush here, and we're just going to go over the entire miniature with it. Don't need to be too careful with it. Any bits that will be metallic or what have you, we'll come back and we'll paint those later anyway. Just make sure that you're getting a nice solid color here. So areas, for example, up on the shoulder pad are a really good example for this. You get a little bit of the primer still showing through. Just carry on around other areas, and once this first layer is dried, we can blast them again. You want to give that about 5 minutes to dry once you've finished, so that it is a nice and solid coat. It's not going to lift off when we do this next step. What I've got is the moderate dry brush from the Army Painter's Masterclass series. I've actually had quite a bit of fun with these. They're a pretty good shape for this sort of stuff. And I've got Tainted Garden in my bristles. So you'll notice I'm working most of it off into a bit of kitchen towel. And then what I'm going to do is just start using my brush here. I do want to get most of the miniature with this Tainted Garden. So you'll see, as I'm going around, I'm just leaving a little bit of the that more olive tone underneath. Now, how much exactly of this you apply is up to you, but the pictures that I saw of Tyler's finished version did appear to be mostly this color. So I'm going to be fairly generous with it. And as I get towards the bottom of his legs, just slow down a little and let some of that original green show through. So nice and quick this, you see I'm pretty much finished. Now, Tainted Garden, also a very useful colour to have if you are painting World War II Canadians. Just something to think about. Now what I've mixed up here, this is a 1 to 10 mix of Speedpaint Medium with Turnbull Turquoise. So 1 drop of the turquoise to 10. And I think I might even want to do that a little bit thinner. We'll see how this goes on. What I'm doing is trying to emulate a little bit of Tyler's work and applying quite quick shadows to the underside of things. I think this might be a little bit thicker than it should, but if all else fails, what I can do is just go back over some of the areas with a little more of that Tainted Garden and touch that up. So I'm going to concentrate towards the lower half of most things and see what we get once this dries. Now once that's dried, I think 10 to 1 is about the right ratio. You might want to go 11 or even 12 to 1 if you want a slightly more subtle finish. I haven't applied it terribly carefully because I'm doing it with a brush, so I'm going to kind of eyeball it a little bit. But what I have got is one of the large dry brushes from the Army Painter, ironically smaller than the other one we used. But with a little bit more Tainted Garden, what I'll do is just start getting rid of some of the overflow and blending those together a little with a quick dry brush. So particularly on his knees and around his legs here, what I'll do is just lightly flick in there a little bit and not tidy it up so much as kind of blend it together. Now that's coming much closer to what I wanted. Obviously not as subtle as it would be with the airbrush, but we've got a little bit of that bluish shading from underneath. That looks quite cool. I like that. What I'll turn to now is the next step in the guide, and that is to grab some Voodoo shade, load up my regiment brush here, and I'm going to start popping this into some of the recesses. This is not a true green. It's really kind of it's an interesting one. It's like if Mortarian Grime had a little bit more oomph. It's a nice, just off green, brownish sort of color. So on our olive green that we're painting here, it's really, really good for the recesses. So just a little bit of this as and where you want to accentuate some of the recesses. And for bits like this, a little bit of it dribbling out gives you a cool kind of raindrop effect. But I want a little bit more on my brush. Bloop. That's too much. Now that Voodoo shade isn't as noticeable in the recesses as I thought, but around rivets and stuff like that, and as like rainwear, that's pretty cool. I do like how that looks. What I've got here is a little bit of torn up packing foam, and I love a pair of pincers which will actually grip when I'm not applying any pressure. What I'm going to do is dip this into a little bit of Banshee brown, and then on my wee bit of kitchen towel, just dab it off until I start getting random splotchy patterns. Then we can use this to start applying, very carefully at first, little dings, oop, that's quite a big ding, and scratches and what have you around our armor. Now you don't want to go too crazy with this because otherwise he's going to look proper busted. And if you're going to go and do the new Antioch symbol up on the shoulder here, do it before you apply your weathering. I'm not going to because I'm lazy, but this stuff will carry quite a lot of the detail for you. So yeah, add as much or as little of this as you like, bearing in mind we want them to look dinged up, but not utterly decrepit. So try not to go overboard with it. Although what is overboard? Now I love my superpower of, don't go crazy with it, and then proceeding to go completely buku nuts with it. But obviously, do as I say, not as I do. What I've got now, though, is I've mixed up here half and half Tainted Garden and some Ivory white. And what I'm going to do, with a slightly smaller brush, is start picking along the edges of some of these areas of detail. And the beautiful thing here is because we've done some of that weathering, we don't need perfect straight lines. You can flick it, tap it, just enough color at the edges there to imply a nice sharp highlight, but we don't actually have to do it. As well, you can also use this to pick out the edges of the weathering. So if you want to, with some of these bigger chunks, grab a little bit of this towards the lower edge. And again, doesn't have to be a straight line. You can just tickle, tickle, tickle with your brush. Yeah, the mix is going to look quite sharp first going on, but as it dries, you'll notice it does chill out a bit, shall we say. So as much of this as you fancy, on as many panels as you like. You don't have to painstakingly highlight everything, but concentrating towards your upper edges of things is going to add quite a lot here. So, away we go with this. Now that takes a bit of doing. It's not difficult, it is just time consuming. And I think because I applied so much of that brown stuff that I wanted to pick out and accentuate those edges, oh gosh, I missed a bit, that will take a little bit longer. Nonetheless, it does look really cool once it's done. So because you're only going to have one or two of these, in the actual force or warband, it's worth spending the time on them. They'll look great if you do. But because I can't leave well enough alone, what I've done is added another drop of Ivory to our mix. And what I'm going to do here is just the extreme edges on some of these details. Doesn't need to be all of them, just a little bit to get slightly more detail, particularly on these rings up here, which I forgot to weather. Oh, we'll get to that, don't worry. Now that's most of the work on the armor done. There are a couple of things we've got left to do for the weathering, but it will work better if we do that once we have the other stuff painted. And that is mostly going to be the weaponry. So I have heavy metal, and we're going to go over, well, I'll let you guess, the parts that are going to be metal. Now this covers very well, but I would suggest anywhere that you need to come back and give it a second coat, you see a little bit of that primer coming through, don't worry about it. Just do that after this has had a chance to dry. I did decide in the end that I don't want all of the Vickers to be metallic, so I've gone back to Midnight Olive here again, and I'm going to go ahead and base coat this now. If you decide this is how you want to do it, then of course you could base coat this much earlier, but I am playing around a little bit here, so. And then once that's dried, what I'm going to do is apply Grimdark Shadow over all of the metal and the green stuff we just painted. Now this is a very dark, it's an almost black, but it has a slight sort of green tint to it. So over our metal stuff, it's going to add a beautiful sort of oily texture. It's really cool. And on the green, it'll just work perfectly. So let's apply that, give that a bit of time to dry. Alright, now once that has dried, I've got my small dry brush and I've got some plate mail metal. Now this I think is the only colour today we're going to use that's not from the John Blanche set, mostly because I just want a bit more, I want something brighter here. So I'm going to very carefully flick along the edges of the metal work with this, get a little bit of texture there, and same too with the chainmail. I'll also do a little bit of this on the power plant back here, just enough to brighten up some of those edges. And with a wee bit of the Banshee brown from earlier, I'll also ding up the Vickers. So same procedure as we did earlier for the armor. Now keeping some army green nice and thin, we're going to do the same style of highlight as we did on the main armor. Now what I'd suggest is that you could here just use a little bit of ivory and mix it into the Midnight Olive, same as we did for the armor itself, but army green's one that's right there, and it is a color worth having. So just a wee bit of this. Now our final stage is going to be one of the last bits of weathering, and this is to take some Grim Rust, and I've watered this down 1 part of the effects paint to 2 parts of war paint stabilizer. It doesn't have to be stabilizer, it could be water, but I tend to find this works pretty well, and it's easier to dole out. So just dotting this in a few areas where I want it to look like horrible, awful rust is collected. And as well, same as with the Voodoo shade from earlier, you can use this to paint out a few little lines of grime, particularly from areas where paint has been scratched away. I would suggest don't go nuts on this, particularly around his weapon. Because, of course, you're fighting the forces of hell. They're probably going to keep your gun in relatively good shape. But for some of these other details, a little bit of rust, it's going to look pretty cool. Now, same as with all the weathering, it is possible to go overboard with that very quickly. But one thing I didn't want to do was make a seriously rusty generator. What I am going to use, though, is a little bit of rust tone. Now, this one isn't from the John Blanche range. This is from the main Fanatic line, and I like it because it's got kind of a yellowy, slightly oily finish to it, similar to how Grimdark shade looks kind of oily. This just looks a bit more aged. So to start off our base, what I'm going to do is glue down a couple of tufts straight to the base. These were one of the, I think it was a icy wasteland or frozen wasteland or something like that. The color doesn't really matter, and because they didn't really work for the project that I had them in mind for, these are going to be brilliant for our awful dead grass. What I've got is a little texture spreading tool and some Stirland Mud, and we're going to apply this like you would over most bases. You want a thick, generous coating of this on the base, but we're also just going to jab it fairly roughly into the bristles of those tufts. So we want it to look like, yeah, they're just starting to poke through this muck and mire that we're laying down. Don't worry if you can't completely cover them. A little bit of randomness is going to look good. So, over the whole base, with this goop. You can add a second layer if you do want slightly more lumps and bumps and what have you, but it's really not going to be necessary, I would suggest. What I've got is a scraggly old brush here and some Prairie Ochre. What I'm going to do is quite lightly just overbrush along the grasses and the muck as well. We want this all to be fairly uniform, fairly gross. Now we'll do the same thing again with a little bit of Barren Dune, but this time you want to concentrate more towards the tips of the grass and any raised parts of the trench itself. Then load up your brush with a great big dollop of a gloss varnish. You want this as thick as you can get it, honestly. And apply this wherever you want an awful, slightly damp, wet and gross. Close to the little clumps of gross grassy stuff you've got sticking up is a good idea. But it is really up to you. Once this is dried, what I'm going to do is to paint the base rim, probably in that nice Banshee brown. And then, we'll get a look at what it looks like when he is all done. Ooh, yuck. And so, there at last, our heavy mechanized infantry is complete. And I think that goes some way of showing that if you do spot a method you like out there that relies on an airbrush, it doesn't take a huge amount of thought, certainly didn't in my case, which is probably for the best, to be able to adapt that and make use of it, even if all you've got is some dry brushes to hand. That was quite a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that. So as always, thanks goes out to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my most gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you very much for your support, folks. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.